the Everyday Consciousness Coach, and my expertise is to help to regulate stress in the mind, brain, body, and nervous system. So I'm excited to talk with you all today for a short amount of time in this video here about the vagus nerve and attachment. This is going to be posted on the attachment community, the Facebook group, where we talk about attachment theory and the effect in the nervous system on relationships and how to get ahead of the curve in becoming more secure functioning. But we also want to address what's going on in the nervous system, that is stress, and ultimately, how does this translate into mental health? In other words, how do all of these factors contribute to mental health, contribute to physiological health for that matter? Well, giving you a little bit of background on myself, I'm a survivor of early childhood trauma, and so I come from a disorganized attachment style early on. So fearful, lacking trust in myself and others, and having a very difficult time regulating my own nervous system. Other people in attachment theory, that is adult attachment theory, which focuses solely on the relationships between adults and their attachment styles, they would call that style fearful avoidant. Same thing as disorganized, more or less. Where I come from is I speak to developmental attachment. That is focusing on how we develop our nervous system early on in life and how those patterns play out in our adult relationships. That is how it shapes our perception, how it changes our style of functioning, our behavior, our mental models, the way that we view the world, and how we act. And often we'll say, that's my personality. And part of what I'm here to discuss is that a lot of what we think is our personality are unconscious survival mechanisms that are set in place during the attachment period early on in life, from the third trimester of pregnancy, actually, based on research around when we start being affected by our environment. So during pregnancy, and through 2 to 3 years of age, to the point where the hippocampus develops, where we start to be capable of storing memory recall consciously, rather than having body memory, which is a whole different conversation. Okay, so going into the concept of the vagus nerve, that's the main topic here. And let me make sure I get her name correctly. Erin Carruthers, is that how you say your name? She was asking on one of the posts on Attachment Community, on Annie Stevens' post, about certain behaviors that she was dealing with around her anxious attachment style and needing to control her environment. Well, she asked me about the vagus nerve and how it affects mental health. Well, the vagus nerve technically is called the 10th cranial nerve, okay? And I believe in Latin it means roughly the wandering nerve, the nerve that wanders. It goes from the brainstem and it travels all the way through our viscera, all the way down, innervating our autonomic functions, almost all of them. So that includes digestion, heart rate, blood pressure, our social engagement system, our sense of being able to feel into another person's experience and sense, are they a safe person? Are they familiar? Are they someone that I can bond with? And therefore, the stress levels lower in my nervous system. And this brings me to a really important point about nervous system regulation and the attachment system from early development. And this is a really important point. Rather than just looking at our attachment patterns, our styles as adults, looking at how early experience in childhood shape our attachment styles based on an adaptation to survive. It's hard to say that that is my personality when it's so clear that it's an adaptation. Believe it or not, the statistical probability of predictability that someone's attachment style can be predicted into the next generation and beyond is 75 to 85% accurate. I don't know of any other studies that are that accurate. Just to give you some idea, if you're not familiar with statistics, I wasn't before I looked into this topic. Apparently, 30-40% statistical significance is publish worthy. You can publish that in a study. 50% is great. 60% is amazing. 75 to 85% predictability. That is, you can take the adult attachment interview and give these questions to someone and then their unborn child. You can predict that unborn child's attachment style. That is how their nervous system adapts based on the behavior and the attachment style of the parent. Because we learn through co-regulation, that is, through the interaction socially between people. So early on, let's take a look at early on in development. I'm going to go into a little bit of the neurology of development. So look at this as a model of your spinal cord, your spinal column, and this meat of the palm being your brain stem. And this thumb here, if I had a mutated second thumb, this is Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. He makes this joke a lot, the handy model of the brain. If I had a mutated thumb on the other side, it would be more even, but this is just a model, so you can get the idea. It's actually even. That's the limbic mammalian brain, whereas this is the reptilian brain. And this is the primate cortex. That is the most new evolutionary speaking, if that's a word, if I said that correctly. It's the latest development, okay? So the cortex's job is to map out our experience, but guess what? We're born without a cortex, or most of it, okay? And that's one of the adaptations of being human, that we have the capacity to learn and grow from infancy into adulthood. That trajectory from childhood, from infancy all the way into adulthood, there's growth throughout life. And a great testament to that process of what's going on is that most of our brain is not developed when we're born. We need support. We need social engagement. And guess what happens during that social engagement? Our cortex develops properly when we have secure attachment functioning from our parental caregivers. We need emotional attunement. We need safety. We need consistent meeting of our needs. If we're crying, or if we need a diaper change as an infant, if we're hungry, tired, thirsty, whatever, the mother usually needs to figure out what that is and meet those needs. Okay, and that gets more sophisticated as the child grows. But if they meet those needs, the parent meets the needs for the child at least 30% of the time, and the other 70% is repair. So there's a lot of room for error there. There's no perfection here. What happens is we have a proper development of the cortex. And so we're able to regulate stress more easily, because the cortex has the job, among many jobs, of downregulating the more primal parts, the mammalian, so what we share with mammals, part of the brain, the limbic brain. This is the part where we bond with one another, and the reptilian brain, the brain stem. So these primal parts, when they get out of control, if they're not regulated well, we act like animals, and we get survivalistic. We get binary in our thinking. We say, I'm right, you're wrong, and we get defensive and aggressive. So when people are arguing on Facebook, it's more of the brainstem or the limbic brain that's acting. It's not the cortex. The cortex is offline. So when we are in an insecure attachment style of functioning, our cortex is offline. We didn't get the needs met that we needed to when we were infants. And even if we think we had great parents, it's not about their intention, it's about how it actually played out. And we're discovering more and more as we look into the science of how this development works, that most people in today's culture are raised in an avoidant culture. And what do I mean by that? I mean the Ferber method, like let the baby cry it out, right, until they fall asleep. What they end up doing is getting so stressed that they actually dissociate, and they develop a survival mechanism of, okay, I'm going to be on my own, and now I need space because that's all my brain knows, and it stays offline. Now, if there is secure attachment functioning, but it's inconsistent, then you get the anxious attachment style. right? And so they have the experience of not quite having their needs met. It's just inconsistent. Maybe it's an anxious mother or father, or maybe they're not very consistent in how they interact with their children. Maybe they discipline them sometimes and then let them go do their own thing sometimes. So it's not consistent, right? So that creates a familiarity with inconsistency. The anxious attachment style expects things to go wrong. And so they're amped up and they feel a lot and they expect things to go wrong. So they often will create problems where there were none, or make worse problems that are already there. Whereas avoidant insecure attachment style, they don't even engage in the first place. And it's not because they're mean. Often people who are in the anxious avoidant dance, they'll see the other one as not kind in some way. These are unconscious survival adaptations. They're not on purpose, I promise you. Now, they may become familiar with their own patterns, and they may go, yeah, I know that I do that. That doesn't mean they have primal control over the experience. Now, I'm not saying they have no control, but let me give you some idea of what's going on in this cortex process regulating stress, okay? So let's say someone hits one of our triggers. I'm an anxiously attached person, let's say, and I'm with an avoidant partner, and they say, oh, I need some space, and they ghost you. They don't talk to you for days. Your lid is flipped. You are now operating primally. You expect that it's not going well, but you reach. That's your adaptation. You reach and you reach and you reach. You might even feel guilty about reaching out, knowing that it's going to push them away, but you keep doing it. It's not a conscious mechanism. These are unconscious survival adaptations. It's important to recognize that. It brings compassion into the situation because this is not something you have conscious control over beyond a certain point. Okay, so our cortex, you could say, represents the conscious part of ourselves. Okay, and you could say that the subcortical areas, the limbic brain and the brainstem areas underneath that cortex, represent the unconscious parts. Okay, so every second, so the studies go in neurology, that we take in every second 126 bits consciously with our cortex. That is, we're aware of the information we're taking in. A bit is a unit of measurement, half of a computer byte. So it's just sort of blending the information measurement that computer engineers use, I suppose. It is just to give you a background of what a bit is. And 126 of those come through consciously through our senses, through seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, touching. And underneath, though, every second we're taking in 2 million per second. It's not even close. Our attachment mechanisms, which, by the way, are mostly controlled in the limbic brain, and of course connected at the root of our survival self here in the reptilian brain, well, those are functioning at millions of times the rate that our conscious cortex is. So when we say, oh, just get over it, you're acting anxious, stop it, or you're being avoidant, you're being insensitive, guess what? 126 bits per second versus 2 million, guess which one's going to win? We need to address lowering the stress load. And this is where the vagus nerve comes in. So if you take a look here, Philippe and I did a whole series called Secure Attachment Saturdays. I did the first one myself, and I explained all the basics of attachment. And then we went into an interview-style experience where we basically dialogued with one another about everything we know about attachment theory and how it plays out in the nervous system as well as in behaviors. Okay, so this is a chart we used here. And notice, if you can see closely, maybe you can't see, and I'll tell you what they are. Down below here, this is the lowest level of stress. This is where secure functioning happens. This is where the cortex is online. Okay, cool. When we go up in stress load, that's where the anxious attachment patterns happen. Now, Aaron, you were asking about the vagus nerve and mental health. We're just about to get to that. Okay, so when we go beyond the point of overwhelm to another branch of the parasympathetic nervous system, this is one branch of the parasympathetic, this is the other. This is the reptilian part. You might say the anxious is controlled more in the limbic brain, while up here, the avoidant is very much controlled by the brainstem, as well as some limbic functions, but it's mostly brainstem creating this activation, or they wouldn't be in this realm where they have less emotional and physical awareness. Okay, so how does this have anything to do with the vagus nerve? Well, the vagus nerve is innervated through all these different parts of our body, affecting all the internal organs and all the unconscious autonomic processes. So the vagus nerve activates when we're down here in social engagement by noticing the body language that we have, especially in our face and our hands, our upper body. And it's connected with the heart brain. Okay, so this whole experience of when I smile, you notice the feelings you have in your body. When I frown, notice what you feel in your body. You might be feeling that I'm being silly, but what if somebody was really angry? Right, okay. So I can't feel that right now, so you're not going to get it authentically. But say you pictured somebody who was angry and you saw their body language, right? If you were actually scared of them and you didn't think they were making a joke, you would feel sensations. And this has to do with the social engagement system. Now, that goes offline quick as soon as it detects a threat. Guess where anxious lies? In the sympathetic fight or flight experience. And these are considered mobilization symptoms that happen here. So anxiety, anger, hyperactivity, when we feel like we can't turn off our thinking, when we just think about ourselves, about others. Oh, what did I say that right? Is it okay? What do they think of me? We think about others and the self, and we observe, witness, and narrate the centralized networks of our brain. The vagus nerve activates both of these, as well as this one. They're all different branches of the vagus nerve, different branches of the nervous system, actually. So in this experience, we have our cortex go offline, and guess what? We're no longer in charge with our conscious selves when we're up here or up here. When we get stuck in that stress cycle, you get disorganized, which goes above and below the line. So you get to see why people with disorganized, aka fearful avoidant, attachment style functioning has both avoidant and anxious traits, because they're going back and forth between these two branches of the nervous system. Okay, cool. So getting to your question, Aaron, about the vagus nerve and mental health. Well, looking at how we can stimulate safety through prosody in my voice. I'm changing my inflection versus being monotone, and I have flat affect on my face. That's very threatening, and the body will start to feel uncomfortable when you perceive that in somebody else. But if you see this animation and I'm engaged, I'm smiling in this case, but really any facial expressions where I'm conveying authentic emotional expression, that's going to trigger more or less a safety response, okay? And that is activated by the vagus nerve. So getting to mental health specifically, Aaron, and to answer your question, in this realm, I mentioned before, these are mobilization states, what something Dan Siegel calls the category of chaotic symptoms, right? So anxiety, anger, hyperactivity, those are all things that would fall into the chaos category in this realm here. Lots of feeling, lots of movement. Now, if this is mobilization, when we go into overwhelm, we're in immobilization, immobilized. This is collapse, freeze, shut down. This is the experience of depression. This is the experience of spacing out or fainting or, not being able to think very clearly in connection with the body. You see, the avoidant adaptation is to take that numbness and go intellectual into the head and sort of disconnect from the body. So they live from the neck up, in a sense, right? And again, I can't reinforce this enough. These are unconscious adaptations to early development in the nervous system. The rate at which we develop neurons during the attachment period is so much greater than adult life. It's something to the tune of thousands per day versus as an adult, 2, 3, 400 at the most. If we're lucky, if we're doing a really good job and we're really on top of our stuff in life, and we're constantly learning and we're keeping our stress levels low. And I don't know anyone who actually has that life. Maybe there are some people out there, I just don't know them, and it sure isn't mine. So early on, although it's difficult to perceive what's going on when we're children because we don't have our cortex completely developed, our parents can help us to achieve this by modeling what we need, modeling the behaviors that we need. Like that old adage, do as I say, not as I do, and why that doesn't work. It's because kids copy unconsciously through something called mirror neurons in the medial prefrontal cortex. That's actually developing as they're growing up. So unfortunately, if a child has a narcissistic or manipulative parent, they're going to mirror with their mirror neurons those patterns. That is, they expect distrustful behavior from all people because that was what was modeled when they were developing most fully during that early period. So it's not that it can't change now. I'm not here to give you a doom and gloom prognosis for how this is going to go. In the attachment community, we're talking about achieving earned secure attachment. Well, as somebody else mentioned in another post, dialectical behavioral therapy versus cognitive behavioral therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy addresses the cortex. Dialectical behavioral therapy addresses all three levels. And so it was originally designed for people with bipolar, as far as I know, with swinging emotional states. But ultimately, that is rooted in a survival mechanism that is way out of whack. It's not working properly. And so the limbic brain that controls our emotions, our memories, and our bonding with one another, it's not working. It's coming on and offline with our survival self. And it sure is not keeping the cortex online very easily. If you've ever seen the marshmallow test where kids are given one marshmallow, and if they can wait 6 minutes, then they get a second marshmallow. And that's supposed to demonstrate impulse control. Well, kids who have insecure attachment styles, they are very, very unlikely to have impulse control because their cortex is barely developed. That's what controls our impulses of the desire we have in our limbic brain and that drive to survive, get carbohydrates so that we have glucose so that we can have energy, right? So these are all unconscious processes. So being able to control ourselves, impulse control, when we have a desire, if we have insecure attachment functioning and we're offline, impulse control is not going to be in the cards, or at least not very easily. And the thing is, even with secure attachment, that ability to keep your cortex online is limited. So what's the approach? What's the strategy to make sure that whether we have insecure attachment style and we're already challenged with impulse control, or we have a secure style and we have a limited capacity? Remember I said 126 bits versus 2 million? That's still the case for someone with secure attachment. So all of these advertisements that we see everywhere, if we don't have a low stress load, then we're going to go offline, and guess what? We're going to go buy whatever it is that's advertised, especially if we've had it before and that's reinforced in our system. That's a whole other conversation about addiction patterns. So what was my point there? I had about 3 tangents going. Okay, so we're looking at the branches of the autonomic nervous system, the vagus nerve controls, and mobilization or chaotic symptoms, immobilization, or rigid symptoms, rigidity, being strong-willed and not willing to move, frozen, you might say. This is my way or the highway, right? That's up here, okay? So you can start to get an idea of where certain mental dysfunction falls as far as what circuit is active in the autonomic nervous system with what mental experience. So if I'm experiencing anxiety, anger, hyperactivity, guess what? It's in that sympathetic branch. I'm in movement. Could be healthy, could be unhealthy, but it's mobile. And it's chaos unless we have the cortex to regulate it. Okay. And when we have immobilized symptoms, it's very hard to get out of that. That's why people with avoidant attachment functioning have a really difficult time getting out of their heads and into their bodies. They want to rationally think through everything. It's very uncomfortable, especially in the beginning stages of this process of journeying towards a cure, of going, okay, I know rationally what I think is the right thing, but considering perception is so limited. Remember, 126 bits versus 2 million. Doesn't matter how smart you are, doesn't matter how rational or logical, there is always another perspective. And you're getting a millionth, if that, of the picture. That's the reality. We all need one another. And that's one of my main messages here in looking at the attachment system and where we start, right? Oh, I forgot to mention disorganized. Look at this. Bipolar. I'm either really low and depressed, or I'm high and manic, right? Used to be called manic depressive, right? Or ADHD. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? We're either spaced out or we're hyperactive, right? So that typically is disorganized from trauma or chronic stress of some kind. So anyway, wrapping this up, mental health is all about reducing our autonomic stress load. Remember, I mentioned some possible symptoms that show up in these different branches here, and they show up not exclusively connected with each of these attachment styles. This is just a general picture to give us some idea of what part of the nervous system is more active, because they're all at play all the time. But when our stress load is too high, guess what? It doesn't matter how many resources we have. The stress will blow our cortex offline, and we're not going to be capable of regulating ourselves. And guess what that means for the dance of attachment in relationships as adults? It's not going to go well. We are going to be our primal, defensive, aggressive, non-regulated selves. We're going to be the worst parts of ourselves. Pulling in Carl Jung's shadow work, our shadows will come out and we will project those onto other people, saying, no, you're to blame, right? As the three fingers are pointing back at us, right? If you ever heard that saying, you point the finger, three fingers are pointing back. It's just a funny little saying, but it demonstrates the idea of projection. When we are stressed, we have little capacity to connect to our humanness, our higher cognition, empathy, compassion. And when I say higher cognition, I mean an embodied cognition where we can listen to our gut feelings and get a sense of people or situations. We can connect to our own needs and feelings, connected to our hearts, and then of course rationally think that through in reference to all of those other things. So ultimately, looking at the vagus nerve and the autonomic nervous system and all the different expressions of attachment styles that we can express in any given moment, well, our mental health has everything to do with regulating our nervous systems and keeping that stress load low so that we can be our best selves. So if any of you on Attachment Community, or you might be watching this on YouTube or another one of my pages, if you have any questions about any of the things that I've discussed today, feel free to reach out. If it's on Facebook, comment. You can comment on YouTube as well. Again, my name is Mike Thomas. I'm the Everyday Consciousness Coach. Thank you for watching, and please take care of yourselves and one another. Cheers.